What's up, everybody? My name is Richard Terrell. I go by Kirby Kid, and you are watching DO Live, a daily stream show in which we talk about game design, but sometimes we talk about how people talk about game design. And on these rare occasions, I like to either read an article or watch a video and kind of give you my live feedback. I'm going to be watching this video for the first time. It's a video called God of War Case Study by Matthew Matosis. And I am no stranger to Matthew Matosis' videos. Back when we did the design-oriented search project and we created this database for games criticism of all kinds, we put in a few of Matthew Matosis' videos, and it even has a lot of the topics that he discusses per video, and this breakdown, this like color-coded breakdown you see right here. Maybe I can zoom in a little so you can see that. There you go. And on Matthew Matosis' Wonderful 101 video in particular, it has these keywords. We made this keyword system, a summary, and we have a rating system that goes by 5 different categories. So difficulty, scope, argumentation, examples, and quality. Matthew Matosis hits about 3s on all of them. He has more examples than most. His argumentation's a little low than the 3-point mark. But that's pretty much what I'm expecting from his new video. People have been chatting about it, so I figured I'd watch it and share my thoughts. So we're going to be using a lot of resources to explain whatever I need to explain, but we're going to go ahead and jump right in. I got Adrian on the mic, and have you seen this video, Adrian?
No.
Okay, cool. So we're going to be watching it together, and Adrian's about 20 seconds behind, so every time we'll just wait for him to catch up. But we're going to go ahead and get started, and here we go. And I got my notes.
God of War 2018 is both a blessing and a curse upon its franchise. From one point of view, it's a bold departure for an established series, but looking at it from another angle, it's a safe product, filled with contemporary design trends. While some changes are for the better, others seem pointless or at worst counterproductive. On the one hand, it's admirable to see a developer willing to rethink a series which was already past the point of stale, but on the other, it's disappointing to see that accomplished by pushing it more towards a sort of generic middle ground between everything else. There's potential in this new God of War series, but it's hard to imagine it ever reaching those heights if it continues to spread itself so thin. My goal in this video is to demonstrate the value of focus by comparing this game to a variety of others, showing how it implements many good mechanics, but suffers from disjointed priorities. First of all, it makes...
So, right off the bat, it sounds like he's going to do a multi-game comparison, which is generally very hard for people to pull off effectively because their ability to identify like elements and make valid comparisons becomes increasingly harder the more examples they try to compare. So best of luck to Matthew on this one. We'll see how it goes.
Makes sense to compare God of War 2018, which I'll be calling Norse God for the sake of clarity and brevity, to its predecessors in the same series. An uncharitable view of the new game would be that it betrays its origins by abandoning the over-the-top spectacle and brainless fun in favour of something a little more grounded and story-heavy. This would be missing the point, however. The original Greek God of War was among the games that sprung up in the wake of Devil May Cry, and while it's fair to say it owes some inspiration to that game, its focus wasn't identical. Even from the very beginning, Greek God's appeal lied in its more cinematic moments, such as the Hydra fight, which kicked off the series with a heavy emphasis on scripted behaviour and quick-time events.
That's the whole idea behind God of War, is it's not just a game, it's an adventure like a movie.
In this sense, the new God of War is very much in line with the old one. The appeal hasn't really changed, only the subject matter and execution. Most notably, Kratos as a character has diverged from his previous incarnation. This too could be construed as a slap in the face to fans of the old games, but again, that seems like a harsh interpretation. Yes, Kratos in the original series was seldom anything more than a ball of rage, often misdirected rage. There was more to him than that though. At times he could be quite sullen and remorseful. Let's not forget how the series opens after all. It wasn't so long ago that some held this up as a high watermark for storytelling in games. Much of that praise was owed to its presentation rather than its fairly standard revenge plot, but that's alright. Kratos' almost unrelenting anger might be one-dimensional, but as a whole the game drew on that rage as its focus. It nailed the tragedy angle, and that's about all it had to do, considering its story was mainly an excuse for cool set pieces. Norse God's script has loftier ambitions, and much of the time it hits them. The relationship between Kratos and Atreus is about as well written as anyone could hope for. It walks a wonderful line, keeping you guessing how much of Kratos' responses is yet more misdirected anger and how much is just tough love. That said, for a game with so much emphasis on its story, there are some problems which are hard to excuse.
I don't know. so far he seems to just be moving really quickly through some of these early points, and I'm not getting a really strong sense that it's organized by topic. It just sounds like the top 3 things on the top of his head, and that he drew some weird historical comparison to the old games in order to basically make a point that I don't think anybody else was trying to argue. Like, I think a lot of times when critics take the sort of Twitter arguments that are just a combination of random people saying stuff and then try to take a sophisticated approach to debunking it, it's just a big waste of time. I tell people all the time, there's like certain statements and certain voices and sources that are just making noise, and it's just a big waste of time to try to, you know, make their arguments for them, or say maybe they really meant this, or maybe if they were, you know, thinking straight, maybe they were going at it at this angle. Like, it's all a waste. Like, just to stick to the main stuff and stick to the things that you can observe. The offhanded way that he talks about, like, the offhanded way that he sort of makes justifications for and excuses for different elements is just kind of like YouTuber kind of armchair designer kind of talk, where it's like, oh yeah, this game's all about this, therefore this is okay, or this excuses this because this game's all about this. Like, I don't know who started talking like that, but I think it kind of masks the point of an actual critique, in which you don't just describe a thing plainly and just say, oh, because of this, because of the obvious things that I observe, it kind of excuses it or justifies any other aspect. You're actually supposed to describe it in terms of its impact and then just kind of contextualize what that element is in terms of the overall experience. And that's kind of the reason why making comparisons is so hard in the first place, right? Like, you have to do a really good job of the core thing you're talking about before you even draw in something else to compare it to. And I think this video already started off on kind of a shaky ground when it just drew that comparison between the original God of War and the new one in terms of I guess it's mostly focused on story, because the first one went with the cinematic approach, and the second one is focusing on this relationship between Kratos and Atreus. I don't know. We'll see what happens in the next few minutes.
When Atreus learns of his godhood, his character does an abrupt reversal, which might be forgivable if it went somewhere, but his change back to normal is just as sudden. This whole arc seems mishandled, and it's downright nonsensical if you leave your side questing until this point, because his dialogue remains the same for those.
But with all that power, you would think at least some of them would try to make life better for people.
We're sick of hearing about little people's little problems.
Another moment that rings hollow happens when Atreus is sick. Kratos lacks urgency here, which is somewhat understandable to begin with, but even when he gets to Freya's house, he stands outside yelling for her rather than barging in. Even the meekest person alive might be tempted to kick the door in under these circumstances, let alone Kratos, who isn't exactly known for his good manners. The central plot also revolves around chasing a series of MacGuffins, which robs the finale of its catharsis. If the entire playthrough was spent actually climbing the one mountain, reaching the top would have been much more gratifying. Teleporting from Tyr's temple to the peak of Jotunheim just doesn't have the same weight to it. Some smaller issues exist as well, like if you hand in a quest with another one pending, the dialogue does that thing where the characters start talking to each other as though they haven't just been speaking. It's nice that Mimir has lines for when his stories are interrupted, but that effort is wasted when the transition between the two often doesn't make sense. As before, we could...
Okay, so this is kind of what I was talking about before, but a critique isn't just a list of random complaints and things that you noticed that you managed to string together in some kind of a linear production, right? It's got to actually take these points and contextualize them and kind of give us a little bit more insight than like, I didn't like this thing, or look, this video game, you can see a little bit of the seams on the edges of its structure. Like, yeah, big deal, right? That's like complaining about a tiny little flaw in a monster costume when you're trying to be evaluating a monster movie. You're like, yeah, we get it, right? We get it. You know, part of the enjoyment of watching those kinds of films is stepping into the space and willingly suspending your disbelief in order to just kind of potentially feel what the main characters are feeling or relate to the situation in some other fashion. Likewise, I think what he's saying here is, you know, God of War's open-endedness isn't like rock solid like perhaps Uncharted Lost Legacy is. So there are situations where you can kind of do things out of order, or whenever there's a non-linear or optional element, it kind of cracks a little bit or shows seams in which characters seem to be completely oblivious to other things that they've just gone through, or their arc is somewhat suspended by these optional elements that you can just do whenever. Like, sure, okay, that's just sort of a decent observation to make about the storytelling and its nonlinear structure. But a bigger point I think he's trying to make by saying this is, I don't know. I mean, this thesis it's about pointing out focus in games, but that kind of goes without saying. If the developers or whoever had a choice, they would obviously want to, you know, tighten up some of the loose ends and make sure that there are no seams showing. Like, that kind of goes without saying, I'd imagine. So I don't think pointing these things out makes much of a point. Kind of like when people offhand say, well, this game is really good but it has flaws or it's not perfect. I'm like, okay, if we're gonna keep saying that about just about every game experience, then it's really not worth saying, right? We go into these things expecting it to be, it's expecting it to have sort of trouble in the common areas that the medium has trouble, or in common areas that the series itself has been treading this whole time. But
say the story exists more to prop up a series of experiences for the player to go through, but it's clear that some of those moments stood to benefit from another revision of their script. It's from this experiential point of view where the new camera system makes the most sense. One major goal this time around was to pull us into Kratos' mindset, asking us to consider what's going on in his head and allowing us to better associate with the events going on around him. For whatever psychological reason, it seems as though camera distance plays a vital role in this. When we're amidst the action, it's natural that we connect to it more easily. If Norse God had the detached camera system of the Wonderful 101, we'd be pretty far away from Kratos' struggles and thus less inclined to feel for him. This is why the Wonderful 101 pulls its camera in for cutscenes, so we can see and relate to our heroes more closely. Norse God's camera...
That's why I don't like these videos in the first place. Just making such a big deal about camera zoom. You're like, oh look, you can see Kratos' expression if you zoom in a little bit more than if it were a dot on the screen. Like, what is that really saying? Yeah, this is common stuff that, like he's saying before, every medium, every visual medium, every film or whatever knows and uses to convey its points and get its scenes to come across, right? Like, it's not a mystery that you have to zoom in on people's faces to show their expression, or at least have them in frame somewhat. I've heard a lot of people just throw around a lot of comments about, you know, oh look, they did it to be more immersive, or they did it for the story. Like, it's kind of weird to take a game in its composite whole and then just kind of pick out a part and say, this part is only here because of these other parts, right? You're like, well, they're all there supporting each other. Every single part, from the camera to the story to all the everything, the way the environments and graphics and dialogues presented, like, they were all as presumably, you know, made together, made for each other, and tuned, knowing that the other parts exist. So it doesn't really make much sense to say, like, you know, if it wasn't for this camera, this wouldn't be here. Like, yeah, it's called design. I don't get it. I don't think that's much of a point.
Successfully places us in Kratos' boots, giving the experience more emotional weight at all times. Of course, combat represents a huge chunk of that experience, and it's in these moments where the flaws of this perspective become all too clear. Bad camera systems are nothing new for 3D action games, but the genre has undergone some improvement over the years. In terms of perspective, Norse God resembles God Hand, with both fixed behind the character. One of God Hand's weakest points is its camera, but as bad as it can be, it has at least one major advantage over Norse God. God Hand is unapologetically gamey. It has no cinematic ambitions whatsoever, and as such the camera is free to ignore walls in order to provide a consistent behaviour no matter the terrain. Norse God opts for standard clipping behaviour instead, forcing the camera back into the game world so as not to break the illusion. An irony here is that films often do build sets in such a way that the camera exists outside of the scene in order to get a better shot, but anyway, even older games offer a reasonable compromise. Disappear behind a pillar in Devil May Cry and it turns transparent, allowing you to see through without denying the fact that it still exists. When it comes to combat, comparing Norse God's camera to God Hand is the most advantageous position you can take. Even the Greek God games gave a better, more consistent overview of the action, and even those kinds of cameras pale in comparison to the simple but beautifully effective viewpoint of the wonderful 101. Norse God...
So again, this guy doesn't make sense with all the things that he brings up. He says something, he seems to explain it, he tries to draw a comparison, it sounds like there's a lot of detail, but it's really not saying anything. Just like a conversation we had previously in the Discord. Like, just because the game's in 3D, just because the game chooses a perspective, it doesn't mean that the things that you can't see because of that perspective are all of a sudden flaws. Or if you imagine some other kind of perspective for the game that has some elements being more clear, and obviously at the expense of other visual elements being less clear, that's just all of a sudden better. Like, making this game in a top-down camera doesn't fix the game, it doesn't improve it objectively, and it doesn't address a lot of the pros and cons of doing that kind of a perspective switch. So just saying like, oh, this game's gamey because they make walls fade, but this game doesn't fade the wall, what a big problem. Freaking almost all 3D games have camera quote-unquote problems, right? Situations you can get into where the camera is not so good, and part of the way that you play is to make sure that you steer around those trouble spots, whether that's a game like Mario 64 and you're controlling your own camera, or whether it's a game like God of War and you're like, you know what, if the camera goes a little bit too close on walls, then don't get near the walls. I mean, fighting your way out of corners or being in a corner functionally, whether it's a fighting game or whatever, like, that's always a tight spot to be in. So the camera kind of reflecting that and limiting your vision is not too different from having a limited set of fighting options. But in general, right, you play games and you steer them towards the way that they work best. And you could say that in a first-person game, it has a camera issue also, right? In a first-person game, if you push your camera right up against a wall, you know, the textures look blurry and you can't see anything. And, you know, what if this game were in top-down? It'd be so much easier. You're like, that's not the point. The point is the game is over the shoulder, and that's just a core decision that was probably made really early on. Or this game is in first person, and from there, the limits of the things that you see and the things that you can see more easily in this perspective and the things that you can't see is just part of the style, and it's part of the natural risks and reward that you should be considering when you're playing the game. So I don't really care that other movies build special sets. I don't really care that the Wonderful 101 has a drawn-out camera. That really says almost nothing for his critique on God of War.
God fails to keep threats.
And by the way, Adrian, if you're saying anything, I haven't heard you in since the beginning. So
yeah. Oh no. I got confused around that part, which was why I didn't say anything. I wish I could see through it again. Although, hang on, you have a comment that says.
I see that in chat. Isn't this the point that there are proven examples of 3D action games that handle a God of War type camera without the flaws? I guess, or so I think the point our chat member is saying is that the comparison that Matthew Matosa seems to be drawing is like, oh, there's a better way to do this, right? So you should draw a comparison to a game that really takes the same perspective and either fixes the problem or shows it being done better or whatever, you know, based on the same sort of core design decision of having the camera be over the shoulder. We'll see.
And gets caught on the terrain. Lock-on breaks when enemies pull simple evasive maneuvers, and if you choose to avoid using it, you're left to babysit the right analog stick. The Soul series is...
Man, frickin'... I probably should stop saying frickin', but it's late. Mark Brown made the same kind of lame argument when he was talking about Star Fox Zero, right? You can hear their obvious bias in the word choice that they use. And then they describe something very common to the platform, to the genre, to the series, to gaming in general. And then they just throw like some negative tone word on top just to try to make a fake point. They're like, oh no, the lock-on like breaks when enemies use high-speed dashes. Like, yeah, it's a high-speed dash. If the lock-on stayed on them, either the lock-on would have to move the camera so fast to keep up, or it'd be trailing anyways. So you're gonna have to freaking understand what happened in the battle and make up for that, or adjust for that extreme movement anyway. Or the lock-on breaks like it does in plenty of games when either the target moves so fast, or teleports, or disappears, or jumps over your head, and they don't want the camera to be like wee 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 like that. It happens, right? The lock-on, there's no like contract or guarantee that when you put lock-on in a game, it's not supposed to, or it's supposed to stay on target 100% of the time if you're holding the button. Like, so what if it breaks? Like, and then the second thing is babysitting the right analog stick. It's called playing the game. You know, do what you got to do to play it. Use the tools that they give you to play it well, and then don't complain about the stuff they give you to play the game and fix the problems in the first place.
Yeah, that one especially doesn't make sense because it very clearly has the setup of a third-person shooter, complete with aiming and throwing the axe.
Yeah, so those kind of things are common in third-person shooters, right? You know, tracking your target, anticipating where they're going to go, so having your aim there ahead of time, and just in general, managing your perspective is the thing that you do in third-person shooters. I could talk about Splatoon or show video, but we are low on time. We got to keep going.
It was also focused on experiential moments more so than pure combat, and while its camera system is flawed in its own ways, it presents a better middle ground.
Hold on. This other thing I forgot to complain about. People making using bad terms, making false dichotomies, and kind of running with it irritates me. But for a long time, people tried to talk about what they call an experience style game versus a gameplay style game, and like, I get what they were getting at when the terms were originally coined or started becoming popular. Like, they wanted to talk about games that were not about understanding rules, understanding options, exploring role-based systems, optimizing role-based systems, worrying about points, or other such elements of like interplay and pursuing goals. There's a contrast between that and then just being in an interactive game or an interactive experience where the goal might just be to purely explore or purely observe or purely do whatever, right? But if you think about it, you know, the word experience is super broad. It applies to everything. And two, when you're talking about some of these new complex games, they have puzzle elements, and they have story elements and combat elements, and they have exploration elements, and even story text-based lore elements if you dig deep enough. So like, there's no point in that in which I say like, oh, this is an experience and this is a game experience. Like, it's all one big pot for me, and you can describe the different kinds of experiences once you have the language to do so. But I don't think there's any point in using experience as a term like that and trying to work that dichotomy. It just falls apart so quickly, and that's just kind of what happens here, I think.
Most of the time it's pulled out enough to give a decent overview of the environment, while also being close enough to immerse ourselves in the experience of our character. This balanced perspective might be a major factor in that series' success. Anyway, it's obvious that a trade-off is happening in Norse God. Combat suffers from limited vision, but many other aspects benefit. This would be fine, except that combat is the most involved portion of gameplay, so if the combat suffers, the game as a whole is substantially worse for it. It's hard to connect with the events on screen when we're juggling several roles, one of those being a cameraman wrestling against subpar equipment. The Last Guardian is another game spent in the company of an AI companion, and it too has a disappointing camera. That said, it doesn't matter so much when moving your character and controlling the perspective are about the only two things you do. The fact is, we can only care about so many problems at once, and this is how games like The Last Guardian or Journey can justify their more simplistic mechanics. Pulling off sick combos isn't conducive to emotional involvement in some grand narrative. Which isn't to say that complex combos are bad. Far from it. They're just a very different type of engagement.
What are we talking about? Did we just go from games have perspectives? Perspectives naturally have pros and cons to what you can see. Pros and cons can be addressed differently using other mechanics such as camera control. And then he went from camera control to, but we can only care about so many things when we're playing. And in the juggling act that we do as playing games, camera, combat mechanics, story, and maybe experiential like events are like 4 things that you have to juggle with 2 arms. Therefore, like, the game suffers because you're in a combat situation. Like, that didn't make any sense. That jump, oh my gosh, it's just so irritating. This is why I don't watch these videos. It doesn't make any sense. It didn't make any sense. And like, the language that he uses is even more telling when he says, like, there's only so many things we can care about. That word care is very particular, because when people sometimes experience frustrations learning something, right, and it's difficult, or they still have to practice, or they have to learn, or they don't quite have the right environment to learn, oftentimes when they are expressing themselves about their experience, they say, I don't care, right? Like, and that's kind of an interesting but familiar reaction to being in a situation where you know that there's a better version or something better expected of you, or some kind of path that you wish you could be on, but because you're not quite meeting up to that expectation, you know, in fast enough or well enough, that a common reaction is to say you don't care, because oftentimes in those situations you were only engaging in that activity on your own volition in the first place. So like, you're practicing a song on piano and then you're like not getting it, and because it was your choice to even try to learn that song in the first place, you're like, you know what, I don't even care about this. You're like, yeah, because, you know, that's kind of a fickle reaction to the pressures of learning in the first place, which is, you know, that part is neither here nor there. But the fact that he says it here kind of makes me think that in his struggle to play the game well, whatever limit that he had to balancing all those elements between like the camera and the combat and whatever else, he couldn't do it well, didn't meet his own expectations, and his reaction is, you know what, I'm going to blame camera, and I'm also going to say that I can't care enough. I can't care enough to XYZ. That's the first thing that popped in my head. May not be true at all, doesn't matter, but trigger words like that, tone words, it's a tone word, not a trigger word, like that make me, they kind of jump to my attention a lot more than others, so we'll just keep going from here.
Yeah,
Which doesn't mesh
that
well with
wasn't
some other kinds.
that didn't make much sense to me either. Saying that the player can only care about so many things like that, and it's like, it's a game. You kind of have to if you want to get anywhere. And I think like only movement and camera in those games are the only 2 things focused on, so that's their advantage. I'm like, you really can't think of any games where you do more than just 2 things.
Yeah, like you heard similar kinds of things said when people were talking about Mario 64 back in the day, and how like controlling the camera is like controlling, it's like a whole nother aspect of playing the game well, which just means that it's either complex enough or skill based enough that there's going to be some line where players can only do one and not the other, or they can only do both sort of to a medium average degree, and therefore, you know, you'll see the striations of skill along the spectrum like that, and you got to fall in one place or the other, so it's kind of life.
Yeah. By the way, could you rewind back a bit, because I saw that there was a transition to combos that I don't know how he got there, but I kind of want to see
up
a little bit before.
If you're trying to involvement, their more simplistic mechanics. Pulling off sick combos isn't conducive to emotional involvement in some grand narrative. Which isn't to say that complex combos are bad, far from it. They're just a very different type of engagement which doesn't mesh well with some other kinds. If you're trying to watch your flank, punish the guy in front of you, track your cooldowns and form a strategy about what to do next, then you're probably not thinking much about Atreus' well-being, and the opposite is also true. It's up to the designers to ask themselves what they want the player to care about at any given moment and take an approach which best supports that goal. This is why other action games use different camera systems for gameplay versus cutscenes. Of course, Norse God's refusal to do so...
Man, it's just like such a series of non-comments and super obvious given statements about things that we already know. Like I said before, when he made that comment about showing faces and zooming in order to show that emotion, like that's like duh, right? So when he says here, like sometimes developers use different cameras to show faces or change the tone or the delivery, the presentation of the events that they have on screen, that's also like duh. And then when he says, you know, developers want to pick the right kinds of experiences, emotions, and expressions to do based on the kinds of interactions you're doing, like it's also duh. You know, this game, like all the others, or like so many others, has cutscenes. It has just pure gameplay parts. It has some kind of mix where dialogue is happening during the gameplay. Like it's got this same kind of mix that you see in games of like Uncharted or so many others, that there's really nothing said about the mix that's happening or the pros and cons of taking a cutscene versus a this or whatever is not or has not really been discussed. And the fact that he's like, oh, you can't really think about Atreus' well-being when you're fighting. I did. When I was fighting, I was like, Atreus, what are you doing? Get up, quit hitting my son, boy by boy. Like, it's not hard, right? So like, he sounds like he's making a point, but he's just saying whatever, and then it's not really building up in a logical way, and he's not really establishing the language or the framework to even come close to making something that makes sense here. He's just saying things that kind of sound like points, and obviously they kind of ring true because he's saying super given, super obvious things, but the way he's stringing them together, it makes no sense. It makes no sense to me.
So arises from the desire to frame the entire experience as a single camera shot, but this strikes me as a misguided goal. On the one hand, I don't want to dismiss this just because it's not a movie. Films are very difficult to do in a single take, but games can be too, maybe even more so. They're just difficult in a very different way.
A single take is different from a single camera style or perspective. I'm trying to think if there was points in the game that I considered that to be a camera cut or like a fade to black or anything like that, or just a decent transition. I guess I tried really hard in this game not to have any load screens, like none whatsoever. And they also, to the extent where they put in like whole sort of transition areas that the only point is to walk from A to B so they could properly load, you know, C instead of going directly from A to C. So like, yeah, lots of clever technical things happened, and tried to make it more or less one continuous experience. It's more or less what a lot of games do, I feel, when they're trying to really convey sort of the narrative adventure thrust of their game. Even like Uncharted, even though they have chapter headings and stuff like that, like once you get into the chapter, it's pretty much a smooth flowing cinematic or narrative experience from the start of the chapter to the end. So we have another comment. Hey, Natsan. It does feel like the online game discussion needs a similar response to the onslaught of nitpicks that online movie discussion has been having to the form of online film criticism that amounted to a list of plot holes. Let me see if I can read that sentence a little better. It's a long sentence. So it sounds like there's an onslaught of nitpicks for movie discussions when people just like, oh, this has a plot hole, and like that knee-jerk amateur criticism kind of stuff it's not real criticism in my opinion. It's an opinion. It's a sort of like an opening statement, but not really true valuable critique. You'd have to say this film has a plot hole and therefore, and kind of flesh things out and tease things out. And the whole purpose of making criticism is to provide insight or illuminate something about the work and or something about, you know, yourself or the world or your perspective, something along those lines. So just like saying this film has a ton of plot holes or listing out a bunch of random things you think are issues is just, I just throw that stuff out and I don't listen to those people. Likewise, what Nat's saying here in the chat, it does feel like games have a similar sort of collection of low quality, uninsightful, knee-jerk type statements, kind of like what I was saying before, like, this game isn't perfect, it has flaws. You're like, okay, stop saying that. Like, stop saying that. You're not covering your bases and you're not making a strong case by adding those throwaway phrases. Local Tony in the chat says the problem with the one take is that you can die, so you really can't have that clean one take shot. I don't know if that sounds dumb. It's kind of funny.
Like, is it dumb?
No, you're in here. You can say that.
I don't know. I didn't want to like interrupt his flow.
My one take of my life, interrupt my flow. No, but it's an interesting point. If you're a good player and you never die, certainly you'll have that like perfect experience, and everyone kind of knows that when you die in a game and you get reset, you're really kind of stitching out and cutting out that sort of part where you died and trying to piece together what it would have been like if you didn't. Like, we all get that. The main narrative is like this core line, and every time you die, it's these tiny little fringe branches that you're never really supposed to explore too far down. I think a lot of developers go above and beyond or out of their way to try to canonically justify their character dying. See games like Assassin's Creed, where you're just being
like you just turn into like an EXE or something.
You just get kicked out of the Animus, or the sync ratio from Evangelion is a little too far, so they have to reset you to something. Like, I don't even know what the Animus is. It's a little bit more mysterious than just exploring the past history, memories of your ancestors. But that's another game. We're going to keep going with the God of War.
Considering the complexity of the world
I have like
and the
a really
action
dumb
scenes,
idea
it's
right
impressive
now.
how smoothly it transitions between
Since
them.
Kratos is a god, like, you would think they could just like justify. They could like smooth things over, saying, "Oh, Kratos didn't die. He just got knocked out cold for a little bit, and they just like, I don't know, like, just every time you die, you just cut to like a transition shot, so you never like, oh man, this is getting really stupid. I should shut up now."
That's just so much work. One of the things you're kind of commenting on is the fact that stories are not meant to be explored with every possible branching possibility. A story is a possibility, most likely. It's one path, and because of that one path, they can convey ideas and tell a story and string together events very, very precisely. This is why games that try to do a lot of branching points in their narrative have to work so hard to even pull off that, like, in any degree. And likewise, it's why it's a lot of work to try to fictionalize and justify characters dying like that, like what you were saying. It's not worth it. We get it. The main story is Kratos didn't die. The main story is Kratos beat every enemy he came across without suffering too much serious damage, and that's kind of what we're going to go with. So even though, like, the fantasy, the dream, the allure is a fully explorable, narratively strong simulation, we aren't there yet, and I have high doubts about it even being possible. But okay, so I'm going to click play, and because you're on the stream delay, try not to jibba-jab.
How far are you in it?
Wait, jibba-jabbing. Oh,
Right.
are you not watching on the stream as well?
I am now.
Okay.
Maybe even more so. They're just difficult in a very different way. Considering the complexity of the world and the action scenes, it's impressive how smoothly it transitions between them, and that it's done without traditional loading times. No doubt this resulted in a lot of extra work on behalf of the level designers and engineers, but we could easily frame all that effort as a negative. All those man-hours could have been spent on more beneficial tasks if they were willing to let go of this idea.
Wow. Another non-critique and non-comment. hey, guess what? You know that thing I don't like about your game? Maybe you should have been adding more characters to Smash Brothers. You know, my game, the thing I like. Maybe instead of making that multiplayer, you should have, let's see, tightened up the graphics on, what was that level? 5? Like, come on. Don't say stupid stuff like that. You're not a designer. You're not a developer. You don't know how they designed it. And saying maybe they could have spent these resources, these floating free resource points, right? Like some kind of like character chart and some kind of respecing RPG scenario, and they could have just easily swapped those points over to some other aspect of the game that you felt like it should have been better used for. Like, don't say stuff like that. We get it. You don't like certain things, you like certain things, but you don't have to go and spend so many words to explain so much about what you don't know. It's a little insulting. And that's all I'm going to say about that.
I'll be the first to admit that many set pieces benefit from abandoning cuts. Countless other action scenes have been butchered by chopping all over the place, leaving you unsure what's happening, which drains the scene of its tension. In Norse God, you get a consistent view of each battle, which is sometimes used to brilliant effect.
Another non-comment. So, like, this is, again, why I don't like Matthew Matosas' videos, because he does this all the time. But essentially saying, look, they have a smooth camera, but what if they didn't have a smooth camera and use cuts? But I've seen some people make movies and things where the cuts were really done poorly, and in this game, it's done to different effects, sometimes well. Like, that says nothing. Like, you can assume all of that. We know that some movies suck. We know that some games suck. We know that some games do a really good job with their presentation, their cinematics. We know there's a lot to fall in the middle. We know that there's some points in the game where it's got to be better than others, because there's nothing that has a perfect line of quality like all the way through, because that doesn't make any sense. So everything you just said doesn't make sense. You're saying nothing. We are 8 minutes into this video and like nothing is being said.
I mean, that's Matthew. Like, he's really good at doing that. I've seen his videos for years, and he's always just like saying, hey, maybe you could do this.
Yeah.
I like this.
That's why. But okay, so yeah. His thesis is about focus in game design. We'll see how much focus the rest of this video has and how much it can stay on track and actually like say something really insightful. We're only about a fourth. I'm not going to do any more fractions. We're a fourth of the way through. Not a fourth, a fifth.
That said, these moments could still have been presented the exact same way without forcing every other scene into the same mold. Rather than taking the positives and discarding the negatives, this wholesale approach seems more like a statement than anything else, which is pointless because it's nowhere near unique. Apart from some brief load times, Gordon Freeman's worst day on the job could also be considered a single shot, and plenty of older games like Outrun accomplished the same thing. You might say that Outrun doesn't count because you select your music at the start, but in that case Norse God doesn't either. In series tradition, even the main menu screen doubles as an establishing shot, but you can still die, something the 2008 Prince of Persia addressed by recontextualizing fail states. Even if you only count third-person over-the-shoulder games, look no further than Dead Space, which took the additional step of making its menu systems diegetic. Norse God's inventory and leveling mechanics incentivize you to open a menu on a regular basis, breaking continuity. Even if you're careful to avoid doing so and manage to play without dying, you're still forced to use the fast travel menu at least twice. The amount of effort put...
So again, just about everything he says is kind of like super rambly and without point, without focus, but he just kind of went from trying to articulate the pros and cons of a continuous, non-cutting like camera presentation, and then some of the things he said after that was like he basically doesn't like it and he wants the game to be better, and he's trying to make up reasons why the game might have been better if they just did these mysterious other options that he's coming up with off the top of his head. But essentially he said the game has a continual camera, but maybe they shouldn't have focused so hard on doing it, you know, kind of for whatever reason, because it's not original, because other games have done it. But even when other games do it, it's not 100% pure continuous camera because they have menus that start the game or whatever. Like, all of these statements are so beside the point. They're so not saying anything. And then we're just off on this weird tangent where we're looking at Half-Life and we're looking at Prince of Persia and we're talking about how they canonically justified and fictionally justified falling down cliffs instead of rewinding time like the other new Prince of Persia. The new Prince of Persia had your friend fly over and grab you. Like, we don't need to be talking or thinking about any of this. And like I said before, it's difficult to make comparisons because essentially you need to have a robust framework of the thing you're looking at, and then you need to apply that framework to other games to at least make a valid comparison, let alone evaluate whether that comparison is worth making, is worth, wasting video time for or whatever. And like, the way that Matthew Matosis flows from point to point, non-comment to non-comment, it sounds like he's building something, but he's just saying random things, and it's not really constructing an argument. There's no complex logic or sentence structure that's happening here.
Yeah, just got really carried away saying that the whole one-cut thing was more of a statement than, I don't know, a guiding principle, but then just got way too carried off on that and started talking about Half-Life, started talking about Outrun, and then Prince of Persia, and then Dead Space. Probably shouldn't have been focusing so hard on that point. If you want to illuminate the pros and cons to a one-cut style take, you can do that instead of the whole idea of they're trying to make a statement with this or prove something that's you're arguing has already been done before. It's like, that part didn't even matter, and that's what you are focusing on. Only gets to the other one.
I've seen interviews with, like, the director, Corey Balrog is his name, and I don't think he ever, like, implied a one-shot camera take was supposed to be like a statement or anything. I
mean, that's just kind of putting words in their mouth and essentially trying to make a big deal out of something that isn't a big deal. But I kind of get what he might be saying. Like, if it's a stylistic choice and you can kind of basically do 70% of your movie with a one cut, but then you 30% naturally you would normally use cuts. So maybe you work extra hard and you get that 70 to like 80%. Then that extra hard and get that 80 to 90. It seems like it's increasingly hard to get that needle to go from 90 to 95 to 99 to, and then super hard to make it 100. So it seems like Matthew Matosis is trying to make this argument that, like, if you go for the 100%, that is like that extra effort needed to do that is like making a statement because it's so far out of the way of normal and practical and sort of economic production. But he doesn't really know what he's talking about, and like, it's just a stylistic perspective. It makes more sense for video games to do something like that than a movie, because a video game, it's systemically driven with its camera, and you can just set up the systems to where the camera's behind Kratos' shoulder, and for the most part it'll stay there for the entire game. Then all these other creative decisions can kind of bend around it, and when you're constructing entire worlds out of pixels and out of math, it doesn't seem to have nearly it doesn't seem to be nearly as difficult to keep the style consistent than it is with a film, when you have to like do real life stunts and you have real people out in the real world doing semi-dangerous stuff. Like, that's very different than what we have here. So I'm not going to give it to him, and I'm going to click the play button.
Put into something doesn't necessarily determine its quality. It's just good or bad depending on how it turns out. The fact is, this stylistic choice comes with serious drawbacks. Combat suffers, fast travel is slower since it has to keep rendering in the meantime, some scenes might have benefited from cuts, and it represents a huge opportunity cost for the development team. On balance, it just doesn't seem worth it. If the camera was the only issue, then I'd have an almost equally large grievance with God. But Norse God's combat is literally problems which other action games have already addressed. First of all, the biggest difference between combat in Norse God and most dedicated action games is what I've decided to call move assist. Just like aim assist, which will nudge your cursor in the right direction, combat movement in Norse God is funneled through move assist. Here's an example. Right now I'm about to attack. Under normal circumstances, if Kratos were to swing now, he'd miss. Except he doesn't. Move assist nudges us towards our target, allowing us to land the blow. On a surface level, this might seem like a good thing, and maybe for less experienced players it is a
Isn't
good
that just
thing, but if
tracking?
you're familiar
Hold on, Tony. I haven't paused it.
with action games, this kind of move assist is poison. What this means is you can never be sure where Kratos will end up after any attack, since the angle and degree of move assist will change depending on your placement relative to the target. This becomes insufferable when multiple enemies are involved and you find yourself assisted to the wrong one, putting you in a position you could never have foreseen. Then again, positioning loses much of its importance because enemies also benefit from move assist. During their attack animations, they'll glide towards you as though the battlefield has somehow turned into an air hockey table, making attacks which should have missed hit without fail. Knowing this, when you see an enemy telegraphing an attack out of range, you have to assume it'll hit anyway, or else you'll most likely take damage. All in all, this makes positioning less valuable, hampers your capacity to assess enemy threats, and destroys your ability to attack with precision.
All of that is wrong.
I'm even really mad right now.
So let's consider a common problem for 3D games in general. 3D in games is really complicated. It's really hard, and it's amazing that with 2D we have super precise controls and super clear feedback, and we have super easy to tell distances and spaces between elements. And then right when we add that third dimension, everything goes crazy, right? We have what I'll pull up the article, but let me find it here first. What I call bad 3D, which is basically the fact that you're watching a 2D screen and you're playing 3D games, and therefore there's always this element that you have to interpret that is difficult because it's straight deep into the screen, and it's just harder to do so, right? That's what inherently happens with 3D visuals and 3D perspectives. There's this article here I wrote called Farewell Bad 3D, but I explained the whole phenomenon, tech behind it, and the different ways that humans use binocular visual techniques, what do they call it, to gauge 3D space, even if we're looking at 2D images. One of them is a gradient, one of them is linear perspective, interposition, shadows, motion parallax, size constancy. And when you better understand these things, you better understand that video games have to do a lot in order to help us judge space, and oftentimes we still judge them not so well. That's why I really love the 3DS, and some of my favorite games on the 3DS use the 3D effect to great effect to greatly reduce or eliminate this depth poorception. It's another pun that I coined. In games, Kid Icarus Uprising and Pushmo and Rusty's Real Deal Baseball and Super Mario 3D Land, and even to some degree Sakura Samurai address this very issue. So 3D is complicated, 3D is hard. What a lot of games have done in 3D is create some kind of lock-on, right? Zelda Ocarina of Time, or Mario 64 doesn't have really anything like that, but Ocarina of Time has a lock-on, helps you aim, helps you see and track and keep track of enemies on the screen. Great lock-on system. You have things like Super Mario Galaxy when you do the butt stomp and homes in on enemies, because trying to fine-tune that landing trajectory when you're on a three-dimensional planetoid gravity situation can be incredibly tricky, so they assist you, right? Games like Devil May Cry or like Ninja Gaiden or Bayonetta, a lot of their moves have these locking, homing, seeking, tweening adjustments built into them. God of War is not the first to do it, it's actually the last because it's the newest game we're talking about. So it happens all the time, and sometimes it's annoying. But most of the time, that annoying factor is because you didn't know about it, but there's a lot of things in the game you don't know about when you're learning it, so just learn it and then see what happens. The fact that he says it destroys spacing, it just adds one more element of complexity, right? If you play Smash Brothers, there's a character named Sonic. Sonic has a homing attack, and when you're first using the homing attack, you're like, oh man, this thing's great. I zoom in and fly towards enemies, and then sometimes you're using it like, oh, it didn't work at all. Well, that's because you were too far away. And you might think, you're like, well, where's the spacing? Well, you can learn the spacing. It's consistent. And even though the game is fast moving and very dynamic, there's still a skill that you have of knowing what that distance is, knowing the timing and relative motion of things, and using all that information to help you decide when and where to use it to get the most consistent results. So likewise with God of War, when enemies attack you, Matthew Matosis said like, oh, you probably have to assume they're going to hit you. Why would an enemy be attacking you if it couldn't hit you? There's another simple way of thinking about it. He put himself in range knowing that he could step forward and get you, even if there's a goofy looking slide. And to some degree, like the animation could change and make it look a lot more natural, believable, but who cares? We get it. And I think actually compressing the distance that's hardest to interpret from a 2D screen, which is the Z distance that goes straight through the screen, so to speak, like this, with my finger. Compressing that distance by using a little bit of tracking or sliding is actually a good thing, because that's the one that's hardest to judge anyway. So if an enemy's swinging at you, instead of going, wait a minute, is that 3 pixels or 4 pixels, when you really can't determine that because of freaking science and the way we know how the eyes work, then you might as well just compress it and be like, he's coming at you, you know he's going to hit you. It's not a matter of making the decision of will it reach, it's a matter of what the timing is or whatever. It doesn't destroy spacing. Like, everything he said was incredibly exaggerated, which should be obvious because people do skillful stuff in this game anyway, and like control their attacks and control their aiming and control their positioning already. So like, what did it destroy? It's not like this game is completely unplayable. It's very playable and still very skill based. So what are you complaining about? I don't get it.
I've put like enough hours into this game to like platinum it, and I've never noticed this issue. Like when I see an enemy attack me, I'm just like, oh, better block it, or like just better deal with it, Like just deal with the attack. I don't notice, oh, he's lunging at me or I'm lunging at him. I'm just playing the game, you know what I mean? Yeah, like killing enemies. Another way to think about it is if you're about to swing with your upper body and you realize, oh, I am half a foot short, don't you think you would adjust that distance by stepping forward as you swing? There's a lot of natural things you do like that in real life, and seeing a similar function in a game shouldn't come as a shock or surprise. It should be like, yes, that's what I would have done. It's what I wanted to do. I was obviously pressing the attack button, so that little tiny half-foot step probably should have been stepped into anyway. And another way they could have just alleviated that is that they just give you a little bit of positional control as you're winding up anyway, instead of making it sort of automatic and locked on. But then you just use that control to step forward in that situation anyway. And yes, sometimes what I call relative mechanics, which are moves that you do that are dependent on factors outside of your character's control, which to some degree is a lot of things, because you can't really control whether your character's on the air or on the ground if the ground just disappeared underneath you, right? Like, you can't really control a lot of things like that, but you get used to the consistency of the worlds that the games present. But beyond that, yes, sometimes these types of mechanics can be tricky mostly because you're unskilled and you didn't anticipate it. He said, like, how could you ever know that? You can know it by getting good, right? You can know it by playing the game for more than an hour. You can know it by being cautious about when you use things, keeping your eyes open. And if the rule is consistent, then you should be able to figure it out anyway. Like, if it always is consistently making the same sort of incorrect correction, then that becomes a consistent quirk and you deal with it and get good. So, like, his point is extremely exaggerated right here.
I think another issue that I have with this, or at least something he's definitely not taking advantage of, is the fact that he has video, but he's not taking advantage of it to illustrate his point. Like, hey, you wanted to show us an example of the track? Because one of the things he said was that, oh, it can sometimes move assist you to something you weren't intending to. It's like, okay, you could show us a clear-cut example of that and be like, oh, here's an example where I'm trying to hit this guy over here, but this guy over here who's not anywhere near him, and I will go attack him instead of the guy that's in front of me. It's like, you can do that, but all it is just playing, other things and not showing his point.
Yeah, I think he tried to show a clip of that, but there was a guy right next to him, so I'm not sure exactly what he would have said he intended. And like I said before, this is kind of like a natural consequence of using these types of mechanics. I felt like I wasn't in a lot of control in Bayonetta when I was playing it on stream recently. Like, oh, you went to that enemy? Like, I didn't mean to be here. And then you're like, now I'm going to zip to that enemy. Just zips to nothing. You're like, what is going on? So, like, whether or not I could master that or,
not use it in those situations when it's an ambiguous target or whatever. It's just something that I would have to learn over time. But that kind of comes with the territory. It's kind of a natural thing that's built into, I guess you could say, any lock-on, right? Any lock-on system, you're in partial control. You're half of what you do is being influenced or directly manipulated by this, dynamic other element. We're gonna keep going because we're at 11 minutes and 48 seconds.
Move assist alone is a huge problem, but the issues only
Jared,
begin
may I
there.
ask how long
There's
this
a
is, 'cause I
massive
can't-
Like 35
over-reliance on
minutes.
epic slow-mo.
Okay, I hit the play button and you guys start talking. Stop doing that. It's 41 minutes total. Maybe the ending is no, it's 41 minutes.
A huge problem, but the issues only begin there. There's a massive over-reliance on epic slow-mo to emphasize how cool certain attacks are, which undermines your ability to time them within a small window. For example, if a Draugr is running towards you, it's needlessly difficult to gauge whether you have enough time to interrupt them with a special skill, because as soon as the animation starts playing, you'll slip into another time dimension. You end up having to correct for the slow-mo in your head, which can be difficult to do when every runic attack has a different amount of it. In other cases...
Man, that is so Johns and complaining about nothing. That's like saying, oh no, in Mario Brothers, when I get a super mushroom, it pauses and then it throws off my timing. Yeah, it can, and then you learn how to time it. So timing is it, not you. And you take in all the factors of it, and then you learn the timing. For crying out loud, slow motion is the thing that helps you time things anyway. So now I'm going to have to bring up my DKART chart because I'm tired. I thought I had a picture of this already. Let me see if I have it set up. You can say whatever you want in the meantime. Friends.
Why can't he just position himself better to not screw himself over?
Well,
I don't know.
See if you can address his particular comment about trying to time something and then whether or not the slow motion gets in the way.
I'd have to see because there's so many different specials that I didn't use and using that game.
So, all right, guys. So let's take a look at this. DKART chart. This is a system for measuring skill that I made a long time ago. And each of the 5 elements, dexterity, knowledge, adaptation, reflex, and timing, each of them in themselves have 6 or so subdivisions for being very articulate about what skill is and how it's measured and how it works. For timing in particular, we can zoom in here, perhaps, if we can. You can kind of see it. I probably should move this God of War case study because I'm not taking notes, apparently. I was going to take notes on things that I thought were really good and worth talking about, and I didn't take a single note, so get that off the screen. So timing-wise, you have static timers, which are things that are the same spacing, same timing every single time. Internal timing is a sense of timing that you keep in your head without any external stimuli. So counting or timing a minute in your head without sort of seeing a clock or seeing anything move or even tapping your foot, rather. It's just your internal sense of timing. External is extrapolating the timing of things based on their stimuli. It could be auditory, it could be visual, whatever. Usually it's visual, when is that thing going to collide, right? That's a classic example. External timing, then you have things like the ability to adjust timing based on acceleration and deceleration. Right? We'll come back to that. Complex timing is timing that is everything but static. So anything from off beats, off rhythms, syncopated rhythms, the works, anything that isn't just a straight up repeated static set or static unchanging timing, whatever. And tracks is your ability to keep track of multiple timing or sources of timings simultaneously. Acceleration and deceleration, that's a skill. And one thing that I always remember distinctly remarking on when playing in the orchestra in high school is that when we play, there are points in the music where, we slow down or we accelerate. And we all do it the same. And I thought that was so remarkable, right? Because you think changing the timing at all would throw a lot of people off. And you think, okay, gradually, continually changing it would throw even more people off. But I think consistently or continuously changing something with a slowdown or an acceleration is actually sort of another kind of consistency that kind of allows us to apply a lot of our static timing skills to. But either way, it's a skill. It's something that you can practice. It's something that you can get better at, and it's a distinct aspect of timing skill. So to complain that it happens just basically is saying I don't have these skills, which is fine. But to say that it's like bad design or whatever, it's called get this. Practice this, right? It's just legitimate. It's not something to complain about. It's something to embrace. That's essentially what I'm saying here.
I think he only sees it as like an aesthetic thing and not like doesn't seem to understand. That's like part of the attack.
He said specifically like, oh, they added slow-mo to look cool, like, or to be functionally, change the timing landscape. But hey, they're one and the same. I don't need to decide whether or not it was put in the game to look cool or to help with timing. Like, I don't care. I just describe what it is, describe how I engage with it, and try to give you some insights on how you too can enjoy it rather than complain about it. I mean, I think that's one of the better uses, the better purposes of a good game critique is not to give you more things to complain about. It's to give you more encouragement and support and insights to improving the way you appreciate these things, which usually involves improving your skill set. And as you just saw from the DKART spectrum, there's a lot of aspects to it, which is why having really precise and clear language to describe those aspects is important. And it's also why this video is not impressing me. I'm going to hit the play button. No more jibba jab. We got to get through this.
This effect is simply too repetitive for its own good. Reflecting a projectile for the first time feels great, but you might find your eyes glazing over after just a few more. At its worst, this can disincentivize players from using certain techniques since they disrupt the flow of battle. This isn't a deal breaker, but it's not exemplary combat design either.
Oh, you know what exemplary combat design is, apparently, because I don't think you do. But hey, just saying I don't like thing and then trying to imagine that it would discourage some player from doing thing, like, who cares, right? Obviously, if you don't like a thing, whether you can't execute it or you get bored by it or whatever, do some other stuff. That could be just about anything in a game, right? Whether it's fast or slow or has a difficult input to pull off, or it's just overpowered, right? You can have a move where like this thing is boring because it's so strong and you stop using it. That's just life. That's not a critique. That's just saying you didn't like thing. And I wish I could pull up that meme comic because I like it.
Combat systems are complicated and there are no perfect rules you can lay down which work for every game, but generally speaking, two major priorities should be clarity and consistency. In other words, the battlefield should be relatively easy to read and everything should behave in a consistent manner. This allows you to test what your limits are, then apply them at will in the middle of a chaotic situation. Norse God fails both the clarity and consistency tests time and time again.
That's his attempt to sort of explain that the game is skill-based. You can't really have a skill-based game if everything's just random, so that already takes care of the consistency part. And you really can't control anything that's happening well unless it's clear enough, right? So it's about degrees, and we'll see if he has the finesse to articulate the different degrees of clarity and consistency that might be important for an action game like this. But in general, because you can do skill-based things already and it's a video game, a lot of the feedback that we're looking for clarity is going to come from visual feedback. And this game has a lot of it, including enemy tells, animations, slow motion effects, arrows that indicate when enemies are going to attack you from your blind spots, shout-outs and call-outs from the boy, and other such things. So we'll see what he says.
Metal Gear Rising Revengeance used two types of enemy flashes to denote danger. Red for attacks that could be parried, and yellow for ones that should be dodged. Maybe this sounds familiar. As with many of the things Norse God lifts from other games, it gets the surface details right without seeming to understand why such a system was built in the first place. In this case, it was about removing guesswork. Instead of happening at the beginning of an attack, the flash indicator will sometimes happen right at the end, leaving you unsure whether you should block or dodge until it's too late. This is compounded by the RPG mechanics which, depending on your level, changes the properties of these attacks. Walk into an area at one point and enemies will be unparryable.
And?
Later in those same animations will bounce off your shield. This
Man, that's so dumb. It's like, look, this game gives you clear feedback, but if the game changes at any point, whether it's you that changed the game because of your levels or new enemies you find that are harder, the feedback changes because they're different, and they clearly tell you how they're different by the feedback. But I don't like it, is basically what he said. Like, look, this flash happens right at the end. Yeah, in a reactable window for you to react. If you see that red flash, you freaking mash that dodge button because you can't shield parry it, right? And it happens all the time. Like, okay, here he comes, get ready. You see the red flash, you're like, oh no! And then you jump out of the way. Like, okay. So it's essentially, this happens all the time when people try to reflect on their game experiences and why they don't like things. Like, sometimes you just make a bad assumption. Sometimes you just don't have the skills. Sometimes you just go with some weird option and it really colors your experience. But ultimately, by talking to a few people, doing a little research, or just, mastering the game yourself and getting good, you can usually weed out pointless, what I call growing pain complaints like this. Kind of like saying, oh no, the inputs in this fighting game are so hard. And you're like, well, if you were really in it to win it, right? If you're really serious about this fighting game, because the fighting game is a strategy game, and strategy games are serious business because strategy is hard. It requires a lot of focus, practice, and brain power. Then you're going to be in it for the long haul. And if you're in it for the long haul, you should probably approach it and practice it without expecting immediate results and immediate success, but small victories, and build on good, solid foundations. And that's what you build on as you go along. So with a game like God of War, there's a lot of... I even forgot what I was going to say. What was I going to say, Tony?
You're
What were you
talking
gonna
about
say?
the red tails and how it's still reactive.
Oh yeah, so like with a game like God of War, like you don't need to put nearly as much time into it as you do a fighting game, but you gotta put something into it, and diversifying your skill set and seeing how other people play and trying different things would help you better understand what's going on, so that you don't complain about really ephemeral, temporary, short-sighted, like nitpicky things, when in the grand scheme of things, when you're dedicated and truly embracing it, those are just like blips on the radar, like small, insignificant, uncomfortable moments in the grand scheme of achieving mastery and pursuing the depths of the game, right?
Yeah, what's dumb too is like, not only is there a big red flashing symbol like right at the end of the attack, there's also like a whole attack animation as well.
Yeah.
For him to see as well. I don't know.
So like every attack can't just instantly be like unblockable or instantly be whatever. So like you're saying, once you see a certain class of attack, you're like, okay, and you should be preparing yourself to do X, Y, or Z. If it's a projectile, perhaps you're preparing yourself to reflect. If it's a melee attack, perhaps you're positioning yourself differently for a parry, and then when you see that flash, that's the last bit of information you might need, and then you react accordingly. I could say I didn't have any problem with the flashing based system. And then that's all I got to say about that.
This means even if you've already fought an enemy multiple times, you can't be sure what level their attacks are until you start seeing the flashes again, which leads to boring defensive play at the outset of every battle. On max difficulty, this is even worse because enemies can level up mid-fight, throwing everything into uncertainty again. Leveling also affects hit reactions, leaving you unsure if your axe throw will successfully freeze or trip the enemy instead of bouncing off. This heavily disincentivizes the use of more complex and enjoyable attacks because you rarely know for sure if they'll actually work. In general, the higher difficulty...
So you scout it, right? And like, he's talking about the higher difficulty stuff anyway, when you should have a really strong knowledge base if you're playing on hard or whatever. And beyond that, like, he was saying it discourages you from doing more complex things. You know, list it, name it. I'd like to see you try, because essentially what higher level play involves is small optimizations. Like for most games, there isn't going to be some magic button or some hidden single thing that pushes you from being a novice to like a pro, right? It's a whole bunch of small things. And with each small optimization, you learn to play just a little bit better, a little bit tighter, a little bit smarter. And a lot of times in the face of the unknown, the less skilled way to gather information is to turtle up and hang back and wait, and perhaps stay in your shield, which is what a lot of people might complain about. But that doesn't mean there isn't a whole range of skillful things that you can do that's more proactive, that's more optimized for speed or advantageous in other ways. And you're supposed to explore and play the game in order to do those. Not to say that the God of War's hard mode is more diverse or more sort of less strict with its challenges and windows and timings. I didn't play hard mode that much. Wait, did I flick it onto hard mode and for most of the game because it was too easy and then whatever.
No, there's two hard modes.
Okay,
there's like the normal one, and then there's like a Give Me God of War, just kind of like a Dante Must Die, enemies will level up.
Okay.
Into like Devil Trigger type of deal. And just harder like numbers and stuff like that.
So yeah, I'm just not really I'm not really buying Matosis's current statements / arguments, but I'm gonna keep moving. It reminds me. I gotta keep moving, Tony.
We gotta keep moving. We have to keep moving.
You can type it if you have something to say, and we can hopefully address it.
Difficulties leave a lot to be desired because the main change is that enemies have their health buffed to a ridiculous degree, turning every engagement into a protracted exercise in boredom as you wail away on a single target for an unreasonable amount of time. Higher health does mean more difficulty, but it also means more tedium. New Game Plus introduces Draugrs with randomized enhancements, which is a much more engaging way of increasing the challenge, but by that point the RPG mechanics have eroded all sense of balance. Still, this is a step in the right direction. It's just a shame it's exclusive to New Game Plus and that it sits on top of the health buff rather than replacing it. Games like Bayonetta ditched this kind of number tweaking and instead built their challenge in much more interesting ways, which I won't spoil here, but it would suffice to say that it's both far more difficult and far more enjoyable on its highest difficulty than Norse God.
I like how he just throws in an opinion there and then just moves on. I didn't like Bayonetta. You can see my streams about it. I think the action is sloppy, and I think the style and the way they were going with the game was interesting, but no, I could only get through a few hours and I'm like, I'm done with this unfair, sloppy garbage. But hey, you can find out more about what I think on those other videos, and I'm going to move on.
Increased enemy health makes the most damaging moves even more valuable, which reveals more problems. One of the best techniques is to freeze your opponent with an axe throw before kicking them into a wall for massive damage. If they can be launched, you can even go for a wall pin, which results in an instant kill.
What?
This would be great, except that you never know whether these effects will occur because the terrain is more concerned with looking nice than providing a clear battlefield for you to work with. If you don't know beforehand, then you can't make informed decisions about what action to take in combat. One counter-argument I anticipate here would be that this is supposed to be realistic or something, but it isn't, because if you knocked a frozen person into a small pile of rubble, they'd at least tip over, not do nothing. Collision...
Such a dumb, fake counter-argument, but nice try, Matthew. So, there's... In their attempt to make environmental interactions, there is bound to be some inconsistencies based on the way this game was going about it. I think there was at one point where I kicked an enemy off a cliff in a particularly tough battle where enemies just like come out of a portal. I'm like, cool, kick him off a cliff. The first guy comes out, I'm like, you're dead. And then I tried to do the second guy, which was the same type of enemy, and he's like, I'm just not going to get knocked off the cliff. I'm like, did they just turn off the cliff or something? Like, what's going on here? So yeah, sometimes there are cases like that and inconsistencies, but the complaint that you don't know if it's going to collide properly into the wall before you kick it, I don't think matters, right? You learn the spots, or you learn to sort of see what the geometry is like on the spots you can do and can't do, and then you test it by doing it. Like it's not like the game is procedurally generated. These are the same environments, the same fights, and you learn over time as part of your smaller and smaller optimizations thing. So like, yeah, not everything's going to work, and not everything is going to or just because you kick an enemy into a wall doesn't mean that wall was supposed to work. And this whole idea of like it's realistic, I don't make stupid arguments like that. And two, if you kicked an enemy into a pile, it would tip over instead of just not doing anything. There's like 1,000 realistic interactions they could have abstracted or modeled, but that doesn't mean anything according to the game that they did model, right? In this game, kick slide interactions have two states: crash into the wall and work, or slide into the space and don't crash for the other option. Just because they didn't choose to model a billion other cases, I went from like 1,000 to a billion other cases, doesn't mean that not including those details is a flaw. It doesn't mean that if they included it, it would have been better. It's just like such a low-level stylistic sort of arbitrary design choice that it is neither here nor there. But sure, I can understand being disappointed that you don't know everything when you go into a battle, but I feel like that's a natural part of anything that's complex, right? Especially when you have systemic systems like these video games and there's lots of rules going on, it's happening in real time, and there could be such precise, minute interactions like a hitbox of an enemy grazing something that changes the way it interacts. And since it was so small, so quick, and so faint that you thought it was a random interaction, but it was actually, highly deterministic and predictable if only you knew XYZ. Like, there's tons of stuff that can happen. So I don't really see having to test individual cases as being a bad thing, and I also don't see not knowing as a bad thing. That's like part of the game. That's like an inescapable part of learning complex systems. And we're gonna move on. Anything to add?
Adrian, were you gonna say something? Or?
I was gonna say that it seemed like one of the better points to make, because I mean, in one of the clips he shows him like kicking the guy into what was pretty big rock, and it doesn't do the wall splat thing. So it's like,
Let's see if I can go back. Yeah, keep going.
Yeah, but basically, if one of his points is about consistency, it's like, hey, if you knock things into walls or into large objects, they should react as if they're being knocked into walls or to large objects, and that's a fair complaint. I'm not sure about the rubble one though, because that does look more like an edge case.
And this one in the stream, he tries to pin him, but he kind of gets suspended in midair instead of flying back, because his feet are kind of touching the ashes, and the ash fire heap is kind of rising up, so he didn't quite get the interaction he wanted. So then he kicked that one and destroyed it, but where's the one where he doesn't successfully destroy it? Right here? Yeah, there it was. Punch, kick, and then he didn't quite explode. And then he just moves him over to the side and then does it properly. Yeah, if the game were made out of like Mario bricks, you could expect a lot more crispy, consistent interactions. It's like, I know what he's saying, and it can be a bummer, like I said before, but it's kind of like saying, have you never experienced an invisible wall before in a game, right? Like, as a lot of games try to flesh out their worlds and prevent you from getting stuck in cracks and other kind of really bad things, they smooth over like uneven terrain and hills and bumps and stuff with these sort of like these smoothing geometries to just kind of simplify the interactions of the whole area. And sometimes that means that it greatly affects interactions or possible interactions that can happen in that zone. Sometimes it doesn't. So like, I don't know, man.
Yeah.
I just kind of wanted to add that like from playing a lot of God of War, like even if you don't get like the right interaction, it's still advantageous to
do it.
Like if you get an enemy frozen, hey, it's still frozen. Like you can still deal damage, or you can kick it towards an enemy. Like there's still more you can play around with that, even if you don't get like the easy kill right away.
And like
still do damage.
And like I was saying, what was I saying? You were just saying it's still advantageous. Oh, I was gonna say it's not like he kicked the enemy into the same rock in the same exact sort of angle and like it had one effect one time and another, that would be a little different, so that if you tried to line up the same move, you're like, I just don't know what I'm gonna get. But it seems like the spots are pretty consistent. Whether or not you assume that it should work on all spots or not, like that's sort of a different issue, and that's one of more of fidelity and visual feedback and other kinds of things like player expectations. But we're gonna keep going. Oops, I muted this guy.
Again, I'd like to contrast with God Hand, which has some unquestionably ugly environments, but those primitive surfaces work the way you'd expect every time. That's why they are the way they are. Another one of the best techniques is to parry an attack, then go straight into an Executioner's Cleave by holding R2. This is trivial to accomplish unless you buy the Countering Crush, which overrides the R2 button in this instance, meaning you now have to time the cleave more carefully. Similar problems arise elsewhere. Buy the running heavy attack and you'll be forced to pause at the end of a sprint if you want to do a normal launcher instead. One of the post-dodge moves causes Kratos to dash backwards, putting you further away from your target at a time when they're likely to be vulnerable.
What is he talking about? Golly. This guy's just saying random things he didn't like and not really bothering to think one step further. So one thing that I will say is that this game has a ton of moves. When you add the new moves, they gotta fit somewhere in the controller. And oftentimes I feel like the controller scheme was crowded with like taps and holds and hold taps for different buttons and all these other kinds of commands that you can enter. So yeah, it can get crowded. One, just because it changes sort of the shrinks some of the windows in which you can time things, well, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It might take a little bit of experimenting to get used to the combination, but that's fine. But two, you put them on. Like if you don't want that overlapping function or you don't want that window to shrink at all, then turn it off, right? There's pros and cons to the moves that you choose and the slots that you have, but that also sort of includes the inputs and the method in which they fit into your current play style and your scheme and everything else. So again, there was like another game like that. I guess if you play different characters in Smash Brothers, sometimes you're used to the windows being certain things. Like, oh yeah, this character, projectile stance cancels when it hits the ground, or it goes into this. Or if you play other character action games, sometimes they have moves that chain one after the other if you keep hitting the button. So sometimes these games have moves where if you delay hit, they do a different thing, like Bayonetta, and sometimes it's just like hit. Or sometimes if you just want to do the hit over, you have to hit, wait, so it clears the entire window and then go into it again. That's all normal. That's all par for the course for games that try to put a ton of moves into a few buttons. So like the fact that he's saying in this game you can unlock some moves that basically make it like all the other games and it's still consistent, the windows just change a little bit or whatever, or you can still execute the moves consistently, you just got to figure out slightly different timings or the right opportunity to do it. Like that's not something worth complaining about.
Some other action games foresee these issues and allow you to switch off potentially troublesome techniques if they don't suit your playstyle. Norse God has no such option.
But you equip the different new moves. What do you mean no switch option? You just turn off, you just don't equip the crazy move or whatever and you're fine. Kratos' basic kit has a lot to it, so I don't think you need to add all these crazy moves as you're unlocking them.
While we're on the topic of Executioner's Cleave, as far as I can tell it's lacking invincibility frames at the end and can't be cancelled into a dodge during that recovery. This seems to apply to other cinematic moves as well, like when you go into a grapple against a stunned opponent. If an enemy attack happens to coincide with the end of these animations, you will
because it's a powerful attack.
How long these are, it's never safe to do unless an enemy is isolated. Anytime you use these techniques...
Yeah, that kind of sucks. But, I mean, it feels bad. And it kind of sucks sometimes. But then again, that kind of factors more into the... you can just factor that back into the risk reward of using the move in the first place. I mean, you are invincible for almost all of it. Which is kind of convenient. Just as a quality of life thing, they could have it lets you dodge out of the end of it before you become vulnerable. But you know, just like lengthy attacks in other action games where you have no invincibility, what's the difference, right? Of a, I don't know what the difference is.
Like,
Just yeah, when Tony know that your reactions are going to be 30 seconds delayed, so it won't make much sense in the stream.
I guess I should probably just keep my mouth shut. I was just mad, like, if you don't want to get hit, out of like doing like the powerful attack, then be more careful doing the powerful attack.
Yeah.
Position yourself better. It's like basic shit.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
You just gotta wait until after Richard pauses to get that in.
I thought he was synced up for some strange reason, but maybe that's Tony and his clairvoyant outbursts.
Yeah, sometimes it actually matches up 30 seconds later, just perfectly, because that's how the video turns out.
You mean
Anyways.
every 30 seconds or something to get mad about and yell? Is that what you're saying?
And the other thing I was going to say is, are you saying that he was actually just straight up wrong about being able to turn off
I think so, because I remember...
I had to check, and that was like RPG.
I would need Tony check it. My game copies I left when I moved. But I thought I remembered in the menu that when you can equip abilities, right? And if you can equip abilities, that means you can de-equip abilities, and they won't affect your button input. So I thought that was like...
It depends on what you can equip. You could be remembering the specials and not the skill tree stuff, because what Matthew was talking about was skill tree stuff. I don't know if I'm probably gonna boot up out of war just to check.
But
yeah, just to check, because it's one thing if he's straight up wrong, but if he's also not about the skill tree thing, and that there's this thing that he wishes he could turn off but he just can't, then I don't know, I feel like that's something worth considering.
Yeah, but not. Because like the thing, like he made this comment before about like, oh, excellence in combat, and this game doesn't do. Like, okay, let's see how much you know. Essentially what you want, like you said before, out of your control scheme is if you can consistently do the move that you intend to do, and not just have any truly ambiguously overlapping functions, which has happened before in other games, and Street Fighter 4 patched it out. I think M. Bison had some kind of weird scissor kick cycle crusher overlap, but whatever, it's gone now and they fixed it. So that's what you want, and when you learn new moves, yeah, it might change the timing of some of your other moves, which can seem kind of icky, but then the true thing you want, if that's still maintained and the timing to do the moves that you want, maybe you were just like really lax on your timing and hitting like the extreme front or back end of the timing windows, like that could kind of be a thing too, where in general you just have to tighten up your timing as you get new moves. But what I was trying to say is that happens all the time in games where you get new moves, right? What game where you get a new move, like Metroid or whatever, doesn't change your control scheme somewhat? So before you're like, oh, I liked hitting down with Samus, and now if I hit it twice, I go into a ball form. You're like, yeah, you got ball form. Like, you can now crouch and just don't hit it twice. Don't spam crouch if you want to crouch. And you got to both control of both situations. That's essentially what I'm saying. Like, sure, it can be a little like, oh no, the muscle memory I have needs to be tweaked, but such is life, man. Like, learn stuff. That's what. So like and also what I said about small optimizations, that includes your techniques for inputting. That includes the timings of your attacks and when you use them and where you use them and the builds of your character. It includes everything. So in a really complex skill-based activity like this, nothing is excluded from your ability to at least try to exert control and optimize and play better. So like these little complaints I don't have a lot of patience for.
Okay.
Moving on.
Techniques in the crowd, you're taking a gamble,
Alright,
one that often
loading up
pays
my
off,
game.
but sometimes doesn't.
Tony,
Oh, thank
Tony,
you guys.
Tony, please.
Huh? Oh, sorry.
This might be an exception. You're taking a gamble, one that often pays off, but sometimes doesn't. This might be an acceptable limitation for powerful attacks, except that these moves are one of the few ways to do appreciable damage against the inflated health pools of max difficulty. Give me God of War implies that this is the ideal way to experience the game, but I don't think even the development team actually believed that.
For those who want a game as difficult as possible, requiring godlike reflexes and strategy, this difficulty cannot be changed. I don't know if it says ideal. The mode describes itself right there, so it seems like he's kind of stretching that point for no reason.
Runic attacks are another good source of damage, but making the most of them requires frequent weapon swapping, which is nowhere near as smooth or enjoyable as it could be. Devil May Cry 3 expanded its combat by allowing players to instantly swap mid-combo, whereas Norse God forces Kratos into an unsheathing animation instead. Maybe this is another concession to the camera, since at this kind of magnification it would look pretty strange for weapons to be materializing in and out of Kratos' hands. Whatever.
Can't believe he's complaining about an unsheathing animation and then comparing it to a game that just lets you cancel stuff like an idiot on the fly, like some kind of... But anyway, that's not an argument, that's not a critique. This game is different. It could have been faster.
Just a comparison. That's it. Like, not really...
Yeah, like, this game is different. Could have been faster, yeah. Could have been slower, too.
I also want to...
Also, yeah,
You just cut Adrian off to say nothing.
Oh, sorry. Your audio's like leaking in too, so it's like it was confusing me for a second.
All right, well,
Adrian, you say your shit. Say your shit.
Yeah. Earlier when he was talking about the because I didn't want to let this slide. When he was talking about the God of War difficulty, he's like, I don't think they really believe that about how that was the ideal way to play. Yet, don't do that. Like, you're not a mind reader, so don't try to assume what they believed about their own game. That's all I gotta say.
And what's super tricky about that is, what if one developer said, this is the ideal way to play? And you're like, is that the director? Is that the main person? Or just like a worker or a playtester? Who knows, right? So even word of mouth, verbatim quotes saying specific things also have to be taken with a grain of salt and or contextualized. And that's why we usually don't worry too much about developer intent. It's such a rabbit hole that I don't like to jump down, and I wish other people would stop worrying about what's intended and just talk about their experiences and try to better understand what they actually can understand, right? What they can actually get to the bottom of. All right, we're jumping back in. Are you, Tony, you said you were booting up, so you'll let us know in a bit.
No, I have it already booted up. I just wanted to say right now, like, you can't actually turn off any of the upgrades. I'm finding like no way to do it.
What's an upgrade?
Like in the skill trees, like specifically the countering crush that Matthew was complaining about. Like, yeah, you can't turn it off.
So once you unlock that,
it's there. It's permanent. But like you kind of want it anyway. It's more options. So.
But then all the runes and all the
runes, like
that one attack where it's like a command input and Kratos lunges back and like punches forward when he doesn't have a weapon in his hand, and he kind of does this cool like boxing punch.
The haymaker, or
is it called the haymaker? I don't know, but I thought that was one you could turn off and on or off depending on if you equip it.
Didn't you say that was besides the point anyway? Earlier?
Yeah, I mean it doesn't matter.
I just want to check.
But yeah, it's cool to give him a little verification and credit for something he was saying. I don't mind. But yeah, ultimately, in the grand scheme of things, it could not matter depending on if it actually introduces any ambiguous, overlapping whatevers. It's kind of like saying, I mean, like I said before, you do a lot of stuff in games that permanently change your character, and for better for worse. Like in Zelda, like I got a heart. Like, can I undo this heart? Like, I think Breath of the Wild is the first game that let you do that. But besides that, like once you grab it, it's yours. We're jumping back into the video, and it's 12. I don't think we're gonna make it.
I probably need to go to bed soon, and I don't think the rest of this video is even worth commenting on if it's anything like the first 17 minutes. So maybe we'll just stop it here. I wish the video had like chapters and talking points, like, you know, this section and this section. It's clearly just him kind of rambling and going from whatever topic off the top of his head to whatever, and the structure is not entirely there, the reasoning is not entirely there. And this is probably about the time where I would click off the video if I were not watching it on stream anyway.
Yeah, the Super Mario 64 one years ago.
Oh, you
I
reminded
remember
me.
was like that too.
Like just the same sort of stuff.
Yeah.
I'm guessing.
Yeah, very rambly, kind of just a shopping list of observations.
It's and the worst part is the kind of topics he's flying by are good topics to cover, like controller input redundancy, controller input ambiguity, potentially, you know, consistency, clarity. That's like some solid stuff. Like we can go straight to let's go here. Hey, where's my website? And we can go to the DO topic wheel, right? So this wheel, something that I created based on the categories of that you can break down games by, and every color means something, and the further you go along the wheel clockwise, the more complex things get. So yeah, when he was talking about clarity and stuff, he's talking about the feedback. And there's all these interesting points you could consider to help you structure and understand your points. When he's talking about consistency, he could be talking about an emergent problem that we can consider abstractly via the design space. And the design space is actually a combination of all these things right here in the ring and how they come together in gameplay scenarios, which are best talked about via elements of level design. So really, you can pop all around this ring once you understand the terms and know what you're talking about. Nothing wrong with that. These are some pretty good topics to bring up. He's not doing a good job. He's not making good comparisons. He's not making good statements, sentences, or he makes some good observations. But this is more or less what I expected, and this is more or less why I stopped watching a lot of YouTube internet critics. So with that, I will probably end the stream. You have any last words, Tony or Adrian?
Yeah, I do. Tony, you go first, though.
I mean, I just think this is freaking stupid. Like, he's just talking out of his ass. Not like, I don't get the whole complaint about the whole. There's like a sheathing animation that takes like 2 seconds of my time. Like, dude, like not every game has to be Devil May Cry. Devil May Cry is cool. I think it's cool, but like, God of War is doing its own thing. The weapon switching is like that.
Yeah.
Late in the game is like the best, like one of the best parts, honestly.
That honestly harkens back to some of the argumentation I heard from G4. You know, not to throw shade on Morgan Webb, but one of the things she said, I distinctly remember when she was, I forgot what action game she was talking about, but she was like, "Oh, I'm stuck in my animations. This is, when was it? 2012, let's say. Why are we still making games where you're stuck in your animations?" I'm like, man, she actually said that. But honestly, some people kind of got a little taste of the God of War style, maybe Devil May Cry style action game where it's like really fast paced, button mashy. Maybe you have a dodge that can pretty much dodge roll out of any of your offensive attacking states, which means, you know, you're not committed to any of that. Sure, that's a style, but let's not pretend like that's the template and the criteria by which we need to hold every game to. Case in point, an unsheathing animation that's super brief. Oh my gosh.
I didn't even know there was an unsheathing animation until he complained about it.
Jeez. And he's like, "Oh, let me just make a really bad comparison. Let's see, some other game did it faster." You're like, yeah, and that's it. That's all he had to say.
Mm-hmm.
So great. Adrian, last words?
Yeah, there were some points that I could sympathize with, but the thing is, like, you had the ability to probably make a good point, but it all depends on your argumentation. For example, one earlier was on tracking, and hell, that's something, you know, you're not even fond of yourself, but at no point did he make any argument about how, oh, the enemies track too much, and I can't move out of the way, so I'm always forced to block, roll, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that wasn't even a point he made. He's just saying that, oh, it looks stupid when they do it. Because they're skating
Yeah.
across the field. It's like...
There's more consequences than that.
It's like, you actually have the ability to make better points than that if you had sought for them.
Mm-hmm.
But you didn't. Same thing with the environment one. It's like, that's actually something I could sympathize with. But the couple video examples that you showed weren't enough, because I think I counted about 3 examples. And it's like, if that's it for the entire game, that's nothing. But if that's more than that, then yeah, that's something that, hey, that's a decent thing to bring up.
I mean, what you're saying is kind of par for the course for Matthew Matosas. His argumentation is always something that I'm like, yeah, it sounds like you're building up something, or you're using some of the structure that would lead you into a really good direction, but you just don't actually do the work to create an argument, finish the thought, or support it. I think he just kind of thinks having his impression, his reaction, his opinions, his feelings, and then just saying those opinions is the point. Because I think he very consciously is not going beyond that line. And that's the line I think where real criticism starts, where the hard work begins, where you actually have to think and make categories and comparisons based on so many different potential functional similarities. But
I think another problem I have, like, with some Matthew Matosas videos is, like, sometimes he can just sort of, like, ruin the discourse of a certain game, because people like to point to Matthew Matosas video saying, "Oh, check out this good critique," and you're wrong, or something like that. Like, it happened with Dark Souls 2. He made a video about it. Like, I hate that game, by the way, but like, a lot of his points were kind of like really stupid, and it just kind of like poisoned the well for conversation, because people just pointed to that saying, "Oh yeah, it's shit, like, look at this video."
that's a good point. Sometimes when you like, I hate a game, I'm like, yeah, and I see a video like, why this game sucks. I'm like, oh, let's see what they have to say, and I click, and then they just make like the stupidest statements and the dumbest arguments. I'm like, this was not worth, whether I like the game or hate it, like, this is not worth watching. And then I click X and thumbs down, whatever. But but essentially, like, whether somebody likes the same thing you like or dislikes it, the value and quality of their argumentation should be something other than, or something independent of those factors, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if somebody does a really good job of making good comparisons and drawing examples, even if after every chunk of examples they give, they just say something like, "This game sucks," at least you have like a nice, well-organized collection of examples that can be useful for anything else. But if you can't even do that much, things kind of suffer. God of War.
$1,000 per month, Patreon money. All spent.
Hey, don't get
respect
salty
the grind.
because he builds a
Respect the grind.
community. Hey,
Respect the grind. You gotta respect the grind.
I mean,
You gotta respect the grind.
there's a lot of people out there that get a ton of money for doing a lot less, and there's a lot of people out there that should be getting money for when they do a lot more. So I don't get mad at people who somehow found some miracle combination to actually sustain themselves doing crazy stuff like talking about video games on the internet. It's hard enough. But hey.
So does that make... So is that it for this video? Not no part 2?
What's the point? We only got to 17 minutes. It's 41 minutes. We'd have to probably do 2 or 3 more of these. And like, if you've gotten this far,
probably spending that time with something else.
Yeah, I mean, this is why I don't watch these videos, because every time I watch like a new video, I'm like, all right, let's see what they got, and then I just get hung up on like 30 seconds in a minute, and I start yelling, and then I don't get through the end because it's more of the same. So like,
Actually,
if anybody finds what I'm saying valuable, then it's only going to be more of the same to the end. And if people just think I'm just crazy, they probably aren't even watching to this point in the video anyway, so more video wouldn't be helpful for them. If you really want to talk about game design, you should probably come to my Discord, Design Oriented. But otherwise, if you think this kind of stuff is good enough, then power to you. There's a bunch of videos like this. Man, I can't believe Sony tweeted I mean, it's cool that the company sort of acknowledged an independent critic like that, and a YouTube critic, and a fan like that. That's cool. And no matter what they say, you know, as long as the video isn't trashing you, you can say like, we're taking all your criticisms to heart. But you know, that's kind of like a polite middle ground, I think. They aren't so there's really nothing wrong with that. I have nothing really more to say.
The Sony devs tweeted out?
Yeah, Sony
think
Santa
like
Monica or something, just like a company tweet,
Oh, wow.
and it's just like, hey, thanks for the video, you work hard, we'll take the criticisms to heart, something like that.
You're gonna add more tracking in the next sequence.
Like, get him. Yeah, maybe they'll add a function to allow you to turn off newly unlocked abilities. That may be something positive that
That would
comes
be
out
nice
of-
to have,
Yeah, I
actually.
mean, quality of life kind of thing. That'd be cool. Sure. All right, guys, that's it for this stream. I'm gonna pop this up on YouTube, and like always, you can find all the design-oriented DO live videos on one place, the YouTube channel, and you can find all the links you need to find our Discord or the Twitch channel, the YouTube channel, or all these cool visual things that I show you on our website, designoriented.net. It looks kind of weird, but that's because I don't want to spend any more time on it than I do. Sorry, guys. The resources are here. The opportunity is here. And until next time, peace. Say peace, guys.
Peace.
Peace.